Okay, great. Thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to telling you about my talk. Can everyone see my screen okay?
Perfectly.
Okay, great. So the presentation I'm going to give today is on social media use and alcohol consumption. And we actually use the Understanding America data set for this analysis. And I really do want to start by saying thank you to my collaborators, Dr. Janine Guidry, as well as Kathy Lee, who participated and worked with me on this project. Oh, wait a second. For some reason, it's not advancing. Oh, there we go. So I do want to kind of start with some background information. And I think it was great to have Ellen go first because it kind of tells you some of the things that were really happening in the country right around the time when we saw the shutdown and the pandemic happening in the spring. Related to alcohol consumption, we really saw a spike in sales of wine and liquor. We also saw an early social media study coming out of China saying individuals who are using social media more were seeing increased anxiety and depression. And we also saw a lot of concerns raised about kind of this isolation and people being locked down in their homes and how that might be related to alcohol use and concerns about that. So this was really some of the motivation for us doing this study. We also know that alcohol content is very prevalent on social media. So this is just some examples. Google Trends of the searches for quarantini really spiked between March 15th and March 21st. And you can also see right around that same time, we saw a real spike in social media posts using the hashtag quarantini. And people were posting drinks that they were making for others to view. And this is kind of an interesting one. It says quarantine is just drinking coffee until it's a reasonable time for alcohol. So there were also other posts that were more optimistic and encouraging of people not to drink and not to use alcohol for coping. But there was just a spike around that topic right at the time. So this really developed two hypotheses. Social media users will consume more alcohol during the COVID-19 pandemic, and that the positive relationship between alcohol use and alcohol consumption, we thought that that would be really exacerbated for those individuals who were working or studying from home. So as I mentioned, we used the Understanding America study data. We were really looking at the beginning of the pandemic, and we used wave 1 and wave 3. So this allowed us to look about a month apart. We focused on those social media variables available at wave 1. So there's some variables that say, are you a Twitter user, Instagram user, Facebook user, average time spent on social media, as well as the number of days people were drinking. So it's really a frequency of drinking in the past week. That was available in wave 1 and wave 3, and also whether they were working or studying from home was available in wave 1 and wave 3. This is a very, very busy slide, so I'm really not going to go into it in great detail. But what I really want to use this to say is that social media users tend to be different than non-social media users. And I think that's important to keep in mind that social media users tend to be younger. And that was particularly the case for Instagram users. They're really the youngest of social media users. While Facebook users were also younger, they actually tend to be a little older. Facebook users in this sample were also a higher percentage were white compared to the other platforms. And we also saw in Twitter users that we had a higher percentage of individuals who were more likely to be college graduates. And so I kind of mentioned these things to say these are kind of the underlining characteristics of the people using these platforms. We also found that people using these platforms tended to be the ones who were studying or working at home more. And so when we looked at each of those waves, the red is the social media users of each of those platforms. And particularly for Twitter users and Instagram users, they really were more likely to be studying at home than those who are not on social media. I wouldn't really have time to go into kind of the different steps we use to test our model, but I will kind of focus on the final model and say, when we took a look at these different social media variables, as well as working or studying from home, we found that Instagram use was associated with more frequent use, while Facebook use was related to less frequent use. But we did also find consistently that working or studying from home at time 3, but not at time 1, was associated with more frequent use. We also went through a kind of a step of testing an interaction. So we added the interaction to our model for each of our social media variables with working from home. And only significant interaction was for this people being on Twitter and working at home. We did not find, so that group of the combination of working at home and being on Twitter, they used alcohol more frequently compared to the other 4 groups. So really, one of the take homes, I didn't really get to talk about the more steps that we took in testing our models, but we really did find that the relationship between these social media variables and alcohol consumption really depended on those variables that we had in the model. And so I think it is reflective of not that some of these differences are really not related to the social media platform, but are really, again, related to those characteristics of those individuals. So at model 2, we actually controlled for how much people were drinking at wave 1. And we found that Instagram use was really not related to how much people were drinking. So it's really this Instagram use was really partially attributed to how much people were drinking at the beginning. And then Twitter use, as we were going through the steps and testing our model, was really more about the socio-demographic characteristics. And when we kind of looked a little deeper to that, we found that having a bachelor's degree or more was really partly attributed to what we saw in terms of Twitter use. If people have questions, I can kind of talk a little bit about more time on social media, which interestingly was related to drinking less. And I can talk about our ideas behind that. And also one of the main takeaways was really working at home. So we kind of attributed to really by wave 3, people were working at home for a month or more at that point, and that being more related to alcohol use. And if we have time, I can also talk about what are our ideas about why this combination of working at home and Twitter use really only showed up for that platform and not for the others. Lastly, and I don't want to take much more time, I will mention one of the limitations is that we really didn't have a drinking quantity variable in these early waves of the Understanding America study. So it's not entirely clear that these individuals were drinking in ways that were unhealthy, because we would really need to know how many drinks they were having on those days when they were drinking to really understand that a little more. So thank you very much. I'm really glad to be able to kind of touch on some things that we found in our study, and I'll open it up for questions to see if people would like to know a little more.